Okay, here we are. It looks like we finally reached the last installment of our study in this series of studies on 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 1 through 8. Today is July 20th, 2018, 9 o'clock in the morning here in the Phoenix area. It's already 94 degrees, so I know what that's going to be like in about 5 or 6 hours. But I'm here in my office in my air-conditioned house and looking forward to sharing the last thoughts I have on this passage so that we can move into 1 Corinthians chapter 15 pretty soon. So, let's look at verses 6 through 8 today. Well, let's begin by beginning at verse 1, just so we can kind of get the immediate context back in mind in case you didn't listen to the last part just a few minutes ago. Paul said, "We know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven, if indeed having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Now he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who also has given us the Spirit as a guarantee." Now at verse 6, it says, "Therefore we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord." Let's look at the word therefore. Keeping in mind now, especially as I just read all that was written by the Apostle Paul nearly 2,000 years ago to people who were living, breathing human beings at the time, and he was using present tense all through that, telling them what they were going through, what was happening to them at the time, so that they would have a better understanding of it all and be encouraged by what was happening. So let's begin with the word therefore. When you see the word therefore, you always look back at the context to find out what it's there for, right? So Paul is teaching them, telling them that because they had the guarantee of the Spirit of verse 5, that God had prepared their new attire and abode. Paul had said of himself and his Jewish Christian brethren that we are always confident. That's the next phrase. Therefore, because God has done what he said in verse 5, giving them that Spirit to prepare them, we are always confident. This declaration takes us back to previous statements in this extended context. Chapter 2, verse 14, where he said, "Thanks be to God who always leads us in triumph." Or apparently more exact to Paul's meaning, "Thanks be to God who is leading us to eternal victory in Christ," which sounds like 1 Corinthians 15, specifically verses 56 and 57. Chapter 3, 9 through 13, we find that paragraph speaking of the glory of the ministry of righteousness that would remain when the previous glory that caused Moses to hide his face was removed. Paul said, "Since we have such hope, that is confidence, we use great boldness of speech," verse 12. Now let's go on to chapter 3, verse 18 through chapter 4, verse 1. After speaking of that first generation of Christians going through the transformation from the glory of the Mosaic mode of existence to the glory of the Messianic mode of existence, Paul said, "We do not lose heart." By the way, it's hardly coincidental that Paul used the same Greek term here for transformation that Matthew used in a similar context of chapter 17, 1 through 5 for transfigured. After all, the lesson there was about the Messianic mode of existence, supplanting the Mosaic mode of existence. You remember that? That transfiguration? Pretty much everybody I've ever heard teach on that. In fact, I think everybody I've ever heard teach on that passage, Matthew 17, 1 through 5, or any commentary I've ever read about that passage, they recognize that what was happening was God was saying Moses and Elijah, who had shown up there with Jesus, who represented the law and the prophets, were fading away and would fade completely away, leaving Jesus only. Therefore, the old covenant was passing away, and Jesus was the new covenant, and he would not pass away. So again, the same word used for transfigured there in Matthew 17 is the word here in 2 Corinthians 3:18. Doesn't that fit beautifully? That's exactly what Paul was writing about in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. The passing of the old and the coming in of the new. The dying of the old, the coming to life of the new. That's the context that we've been looking at now for the last 4 or 5 installments of studies on 2 Corinthians 5 to get the context of what Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 8. Now, chapter 4, verses 8 through 12. What else but the confidence of which Paul spoke in 2 Corinthians 5 could motivate him to speak of being hard-pressed on every side, yet not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed? Also that, while death operated in the Jewish saints, life would operate in the Gentile saints. And the confidence of that corporate life is found in chapter 5, verse 4. We who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Some more context in reference to we are always confident of chapter 5, verse 6. In chapter 4, verses 16 through 17, just as Paul connected their being transformed from one stage of glory to another, more excellent stage of glory, with their not losing heart in chapter 3, 18 through chapter 4, verse 1, so here Paul made that same connection. Hear the confidence in his voice. We don't lose heart, verse 16. For our light affliction is working for us a far more exceeding eternal weight of glory. Now, chapter 5, verse 1. In this verse, Paul wrote of their confidence again by speaking of how they knew that, if their earthly house were destroyed, they had a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And coming full circle now, chapter 5, verses 5 through 7. After he spoke of God's guarantee via the Spirit that all he had discussed would indeed come to fruition, and soon, per verse 10, he wrote one last time in this context about their confidence, which enabled them to walk by God-pleasing faith. And that should make you think of Hebrews 11, verse 6 about faith, pleasing God. Now, I went through all that to show that all of this was about Paul giving them confidence through all that they were enduring, whatever they might have been enduring. There was a purpose for all of it. There was a goal for all of it, as we talked about with regard to the word end in chapter 3, that word end in verse 13 is the word of a reaching of a goal, not just the end of a rope. So that's what the general theme of all of this is. It's not just Paul defending his apostleship, as we talked about, his authority, but at the same time giving them confidence in him and his word and what he'd been going through for them, and proving all that, of course, by miracles, as talked about in both those letters. So we move on from therefore, we are always confident, to knowing, literally having come to know, implying that this was something Paul or corporate Israel didn't understand at one point in their life, that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. Okay, notice it says body, not bodies plural. So that's bringing something to mind right there about this being a corporate concept, not an individual concept. As we talked about various times earlier with chapter 5, verse 1 and so on, you have several people, we being a plural pronoun, involved in a singular body. So Paul says, knowing that we are at home in the body, not bodies. So what body was he talking about? The then present body of the context, of course, the body of Moses. All of 2 Corinthians 3 is about the law of Moses, as well as chapter 5 verse 1 about their earthly house, the house of their land, their world, and their tent, their tabernacle. Their world was the temple, and the temple represented the law, represented them as a collective or corporate people underneath or within the law of the Old Covenant system. The body in which they existed was the body of Moses, we could say. And Paul referred to that concept in Romans 7 verse 24 that we've talked about 2 or 3 times already, where Paul said, who will deliver me from this body of death? As 2 Corinthians 3 teaches, the law, the Old Covenant system, was a religion of death. These Old Covenant people of God, Israel, are called the body of Moses. And why were they called the body of Moses? Because, as Paul told these brethren in his previous letter to them, they, the Israelites, were baptized into Moses, chapter 10, verse 2 of 1 Corinthians, just as they had been baptized into Christ, Galatians 3:27, and were therefore correspondingly called the body of Christ. The next phrase is at home, that we are at home in the body. Okay, oddly enough, although scholar M.R. Vincent didn't agree with the body here being a reference to Old Covenant Israel, or at least didn't take that position, I'm not sure if he even considered it, yet when, in his word studies in the New Testament, he conflictingly wrote about the original phrase for at home, he supported my position by saying that it means in people, to be among one's own people, which corresponds to what we discussed concerning the term habitation back in verse 2, namely that the original term there alludes more to the inhabitants of the house than it does to the house itself. Anyway, speaking of scholars, it's interesting that so many others, such as Barnes, Clark, Linsky, and Robertson, say the same thing as Vincent did, yet ignoring the plural people. They'll turn around in their bias to the traditional individual body explanation. So, while the Jews growing up in Judaism may have felt perfectly at home in their ancestral body, the body of Moses, yet Paul, via the Spirit's revelation to him, no doubt, came to the realization that it was never meant to be a home of an eternal nature. In fact, he was saying here, chapter 4, verse 18, for example, that as long as we're in this temporary home, we're absent from the Lord. Apparently, the Greek phrase for we're absent from the Lord is somewhat difficult to translate into English. The Greek word ekdemoumen for being absent is in the genitive case, the case in which the prefix denotes motion away from something. Marshall's Interlinear renders it this way: we are away from home, away from the Lord. V.P. Furnish in the Anchor Bible rendered it this way: away from our home with the Lord. And in verse 8, Paul spoke of the desire to be present with the Lord. Back in verse 3, we discussed the bride, the church, being prepared for her marriage to the Lord and the importance of being clothed in the wedding garment. Well, with matrimony in mind, again, we should be able to also see the connection between this verse in this context with 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, the only other place where the English phrase with the Lord is found in the King James Version, and by that same writer, Paul. Speaking of the Lord coming for or to meet his bride in the air, that is, the spiritual realm, for their wedding ceremony, Paul said, and so we shall always be with the Lord. So prior to that time, that is, before the purification of the bride by the Spirit was completed, Ephesians 5:25-27. And before the law, the sin and sin death had been rendered powerless at and by the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15:26 and 54-55. The betrothed church could not be with her Lord. In fact, in his chapter to the Philippians about the resurrection, to which Hebrew Christians had only partly attained, chapter 3, verse 16, Paul chose matrimonial language about that time of the final transformation of the body when he said that I may know him, verse 10, and then confer verses 20 and 21. That I may know him is biblical language of two becoming one. It's one way of referring to the act of intimacy between a newly wedded couple, when a husband knows his wife on the wedding night, on honeymoon, and vice versa when she knows him. So it was a biblical way of referring to that, knowing somebody. And so with all of this marriage stuff going on, this marriage motif, this wedding motif that is behind the scenes in all of this, it makes perfect sense. The resurrection is another word that refers to the time of the wedding. And coming to know the Lord is language referring to the wedding and marriage and so on. So Paul is saying, again in this verse, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. And Paul said we don't want to be absent from him. We are the bride. We have been going through this time of purification or sanctification now for all these years, and we are anxious to get wedded to the Lord. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to verses 7 and 8. For we walk by faith, not by sight. In other words, they're in the transition. It's by faith, because sight would mean that they are married, that it has all come to fruition. So we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. So he's saying, sort of the opposite here. We'd really like to be absent from the body so that we can be present with the Lord. Okay, let's look at this phrase, we walk by faith. Out of the 98 times walk, which is the Greek word peripateo, is found in the New Testament, Paul used it 35 times. 8 of those times just in the short epistle of Ephesians. So it was clearly one of his favorite expressions to denote the manner in which one conducts one's life. The original term for by here is dia, a genitive term meaning through, or by means of. In fact, the emphatic diaglot renders the original as, by means of faith we are walking, not by means of sight. Which brings up the following thought. Though the term walk isn't a Greek participle, what we consider an ing word in English, it is in the Greek present tense, meaning that, as the diaglot indicates, it may be translated as a participle in English. The diaglot again says, that's an interlinear. The diaglot is an interlinear where it takes the Greek words and renders them into English right in front of you on paper. It says, by means of faith we are walking. Now, I'm not going to go through some other notes here on this. I'm going to skip a paragraph or two here. Let's move on down. If you're following in on the notes, you can read through that later, but it's just sort of repetitious about walking and so on. Now, the only other time Paul referred to faith in this context of chapter 2:14 through chapter 5 verse 8 was in chapter 4 verses 13 and 14. Since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what is written, I believed and therefore I spoke, we also believe and therefore speak, knowing that he who raised up the Lord Jesus will also raise us up with Jesus and present us with you. That is, the Jewish Christians with the Gentile Christians. Paul quoted Psalm 116 verse 10 when he said this here, which like 2 Corinthians 4:13, is in the context of affliction, even to the point of death. But this psalmist, trusting that God was on his side, took courage and spoke out regardless of his circumstances. Likewise, Paul, including his faithful Jewish Christian brethren, was saying that they, knowing that they would be, get this, resurrected right along with their faithful Gentile brethren, there's the corporate idea, took courage in their state of affairs, a state which they realized was working out the life of Jesus not only among and for them, but also among and for the Gentile Christians. Chapter 4, verse 12. And isn't that what our 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 8 context has all been about? Resurrection life. That's what it's been about so far. And we're through verse 7 now. Anyway, Paul said they were walking by faith, not by sight. This, of course, harkens back to chapter 4, verse 18. Paul said, we don't look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. If that isn't a provider of faith and courage, then what could be? So it's no wonder Paul went on to say again, we are confident. Yes. You know, I brought up 1 Thessalonians 4:17 a little bit ago, and I want to add a quick note in here, because as we've noted in this particular discussion, this last installment in our series, and our look at these verses, we've brought forth from this context of chapter 2 and through chapter 6, how that Paul was emphasizing their hope, and that it was a very positive thing, and that they knew it was all going to come to a conclusion for their good very soon. There was confidence being instilled by Paul into the minds of his audience. He was encouraging them, trying his best to give them courage. Now, if you look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 through 18, you see Paul, the same guy, to a different group of people who were also going through persecution, perhaps more so than the Corinthians. And in verse 18, he ended that context about resurrection by saying to read these things or tell these things to one another in order to comfort you. He was giving that information to bring them comfort. So that was something Paul did by referring to their time of resurrecting to life or being married to the Lord. Okay, back to 2 Corinthians 5 now. In verse 8, Paul said, well pleased rather to be absent from the body and present with the Lord. So Paul and his Jewish Christian brethren weren't only confident in their walk or in their walking, in other words, in the necessity of the way they were having to live and conduct themselves and endure what they were enduring, that it was something that God said was going to happen. But although harshly persecuted, they were even pleased that they were in essence walking out of a body of death and into a body of life, reminiscent of Psalm 23. Out of a place in which God could no longer be found and into a place in which he wasn't only present, but also from which he would never leave. Just check out chapters 21 through 22 of Revelation, which pictures that very concept. Now, let's end this with some more charts. Now, the last chart that I had for verse 4, I just seem to have found it impossible to picture it for you in audio format. And that's still going to be difficult here, but I'm going to try it because it's probably not as difficult. So I want to compare or contrast, depending on the line of comparison or contrast here in the chart, passages like Romans 8, Philippians 3, John 14, and Revelation 21 with 2 Corinthians 5. Just in case you can't see the chart, in case you have not yet downloaded the PDF, just think about these. These are just really cool to me, and it seems to me to be impossible for someone not to see what all's going on here in the New Testament. That these passages, these writers, are referring to the same thing. 2 Corinthians 5 now. Let's compare it with Romans 8. 2 Corinthians 5, you have the tent of mortality. Romans 8, the body of death. 2 Corinthians 5, flesh versus spirit. Romans 8, flesh versus spirit. 2 Corinthians 5, law kills versus the spirit gives life. Romans 8, law of death versus the spirit of life. 2 Corinthians 5, persecution. Romans 8, sufferings at this present time. 2 Corinthians 5, resurrection, spirit and life. Romans 8, resurrection, spirit and life. 2 Corinthians 5, groanings. Romans 8, groanings. 2 Corinthians 5, mortality swallowed up by life. Romans 8, redemption of the body. 2 Corinthians 5, old creation into a new creation. Romans 8, old creation subject to hope. Now, I didn't give you all the verses that are found in the chart. You'll have to go look for those yourself. But just that one, just the one between 2 Corinthians 5 and Romans 8 is an amazing picture. Whether it's to the Roman people or to the Corinthian people or now to the Philippian people. Let's look at 2 Corinthians 5 and Philippians 3. 2 Corinthians 5, death in us, life in you. Philippians, poured out for you. Paul is being poured out for them. 2 Corinthians 5, groaning and burdened. Philippians 3, suffering at the hands of persecutors. 2 Corinthians 5, this earthly tent or body. Philippians 3, body of humiliation. 2 Corinthians 5, clothed, swallowed up, tent and body. Philippians 3, transformed and conformed body. 2 Corinthians 5, heavenly home. Philippians 3, upward call in heaven. 2 Corinthians 5, earthly house and things associated with that earthly house, which we talked about was the land of Israel. Philippians 3, earthly things again, and things that they need to be leaving behind. 2 Corinthians 5, not found naked, present with the Lord. Philippians 3, found in Him and perfected. 2 Corinthians 5, resurrection. Philippians 3, resurrection. And by the way, not only, as I've mentioned before, do I have an entire study on Romans 8 on my website in PDF form as well as in audio form, but I also have one on Philippians 3. And to add to that, I also have one on John 14, which is where we're going to go next on the chart. Let's compare those two. 2 Corinthians 5, groaning and burdened. John 14, troubled. 2 Corinthians 5, they were absent from the Lord. John 14, a place was being prepared while Jesus was gone. 2 Corinthians 5, we have a building. John 14, a place for the disciples. 2 Corinthians 5, present with the Lord. John 14, Jesus to receive them to Himself. 2 Corinthians 5, the Spirit was their guarantee. John 14, the Spirit was promised. One more. That's Revelation 21. No, I don't have a talk on Revelation 21. There's plenty of stuff out there already on that, so I haven't done that. But let's do a comparison here. 2 Corinthians 5, old things in creation passed away. Revelation 21, first heaven and earth passed away. 2 Corinthians 5, new creation. Revelation 21, new heaven and earth. 2 Corinthians 5, a house not made with human hands. Revelation 21, a holy city. 2 Corinthians 5, from God. Revelation 21, from God. 2 Corinthians 5, from heaven. Revelation 21, from heaven. 2 Corinthians 5, building of God. Revelation 21, the tabernacle of God. 2 Corinthians 5, present with the Lord. Revelation 21, God dwells with men, His people. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, groaning and burdened. Revelation 21, no sorrow or pain, etc. Well, time would fail me to enter into the creation of a chart which would doubtless demonstrate how well 2 Corinthians 5 corresponds to 1 Corinthians 15. the chapter in which Paul initially wrote about the subject of resurrection to these brethren. Okay, well, I thank you so much for sticking with me through all of these 5 lessons on 2 Corinthians chapter 5, if you did do that. And I hope that you did so first, that is, before 1 Corinthians 15. I know that people will automatically and logically, perhaps in their minds, go to 1 Corinthians 15 first before they go to 2 Corinthians 5 if they see those 2 in my list of lessons and studies and audios. But to try and make sure they actually do go to 2 Corinthians 5 first, which sets the stage so beautifully and perfectly for 1 Corinthians 15, I'm going to mention at the beginning of my studies in 1 Corinthians 15, when I get to them pretty soon, I hope, that they need to stop. If they've started listening to 1 Corinthians 15, I'm going to ask them to stop and come and listen to this series first, for, as I said, this, to me, is a must to understand this passage and its surrounding context before one delves into the difficult chapter of 1 Corinthians 15. So thank you for your time and for any comments and questions you might have sent so far and you might continue to send. And I hope that you will share these with others. Share these links to these studies in writing or in audio form with other people. And my website, asightforthelord.com. And hopefully this will help a lot of other people and me as well as I receive feedback.